I'm Jim Ferguson, and I'm a member of the Sandy M Fly Casters, and I'm going to be tying a fly today, the one that I use almost the first time I get out on the water. It's called the tie-down Caddis. It's a pattern I learned when I was about 12 years old and has worked very well on all sorts of waters in Oregon. The hook I'm going to be using is a Mustad 3399A. I like to use it barbless. So if you're just starting out tying fishing flies and you see a recipe and you get a little confused about it, the order in which you see them is the order in which you tie things on to the hook. Now, this one calls for either tan or gray thread. So I'm going to pull out about almost a little over maybe a foot of thread, and I'm going to start more or less back a couple eye lengths from the front of the hook, and I'm going to wrap concentric wraps back to the rear. It's important to put what we call a thread base down onto the hook, so that later on you don't try to attach materials and it slips around the hook. The next item that goes on is going to be the body material. And early in the year, you start out with, say, a size 10. Midsummer, the hatches begin to get smaller and they begin to get a darker color on the bodies. Late September, the flies that hatch out are even smaller and darker in color, and that's when I go to the darker orange color. And so I kind of peel it down and just use maybe 2 strands for the body. You don't want the body to be overly thick, because every time you get something thick here, you close down the hook gape, which means the hooking power is being lost. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move forward on this hook with the thread, and I'm going to tie in the thread on top. So I'm going to trim it. I'm going to take the thread back to the rear and just let that sit there. And now I'm going to choose a feather from this saddle. These are going to represent the legs of the insect, and also caddis are real fuzzy. So here's the feather. It's what's called a furnace hackle with a black stripe going down the middle of it, and the lighter shades of brown off to the side. It comes slightly forward here, and I'm going to tie it in on my side of the hook, wrap the hackle forward, and take this stem that's sticking out here and bend it back into a U shape and bind it down, take the thread then forward and cut the waist off. And now I can pull on this and I'm not too worried that it's not going to slip out. What I'm going to do is to make one complete wrap of the body material behind the feather, and then just make concentric wraps to form the body of the fly. Now I'm going to stop at least a hook gape behind the front of the fly, and 3 to 4 wraps should hold the material. Quite often tyers end up with a very large head. It's called palmering a hackle, where you make about 3, 4, 5 turns of the hackle as you go forward, then tie it off and trim the waist. Now I'm going to make a few wraps here to make sure that that's cinched down well. And caddis are a fat bug. They usually have a large rear end to them and taper, if anything, taper down to smaller towards the front. And then they've got this, we call them legs, but it's to imitate the leg. Now what I'm going to do to make this thing into a tied down caddis, I'm going to take some deer hair and I'm going to cut off a bunch of it here. This section from here to here is actually made up of cells that are hollow. It's good for the fly tire in that it helps float the fly. And then you have to decide how much hair do I want. Well, on this particular fly, this is a size 14. It's a fairly small hook, so I don't need that much. Now the tips of this are fairly uneven. So one of the things we have to do is we put it into what's called a hair stacker. You tap it. Then when you pull it out, the tips are even. You kind of figure out, okay, that's where I'm going to tie in the head. And then what you do is you get some glue. Put this right where I'm going to be tying in that hair bunch. Then I'm going to pre-trim the hair. Okay, now what I'm going to do is come right along the top, place the fibers where I want that end to be, go up, and I notice that the thread is going to go in between those fingers, come down on the other side, and come up. And you tighten it a little bit, and you make another. It's called a soft loop. You do 2 of those, but I'm always pulling for tension in the up direction, and then I can come by or around and bind the fibers down. The whip finish tool, I hook, catch, come across, and then I make several wraps. And now what I'm going to do is put in 2 sets of 3 wraps, which should be plenty for the front of that fly. Thread, I'm just going to put the sharp edge of the scissors up against that and run it. You get a smaller tag that way. You take this thread that I have back here, and I'm going to wrap a little thread base here at the butt of this fly. So I'm going to come around, and that gives the material that I'm going to put on there something to grip against. And I'm going to take these fibers, pull them down, come up and over, and I've created a little shell back over the top of this fly. And then I'm going to take the whip finish tool, and you just put enough of the head cement in there to soak into the thread. Same way up front. In the water, this represents a caddis that is emerging. There's a couple different types of caddis. You get this case caddis that builds a case around it, crawls along the rocks and stuff. There's also a free swimming caddis, and that one does not have a protective coating. There's also something called a crest bug, which resembles the caddis, that sometimes the current makes one of these caddis bugs lose its hold on the rocks, and it'll go swimming on down or just in the current. And so I fish this in the riffles, in behind what we call pocket water, into areas like that. And then right where the riffle goes into a deeper pool, that's a good spot where this can be used. Provides good action. On the Deschutes River, I've used it, and because there's a lot of plant growth on the bottom of that river. So that's a tied down caddis.
Shall I see thy bright shores in the sunlight, the heather of hills and the rising morn, the rolling grassy mist rolls east in the morning to run the wild hills of the Coollands above. Far away seaward, the green